The mahogany floor of the Vancroft Estate was so polished I could see my own failure reflected in it. I was kneeling, the rough burlap of my trousers biting into my shins, scrubbing at a streak of mud that refused to vanish. It was the weight of expectation, not the physical labor, that was crushing my spine. For 27 years, I had been the silent pillar of this house, the man who never groaned, never faltered, and never spoke back. I lived for the quiet hope that my loyalty would one day buy my freedom. Suddenly, a heavy, mud-caked riding boot crashed down inches from my hand, splashing grey slush onto the section I had just perfected. I looked up. Balthazar, the young heir whose cruelty was as refined as his silk cravat, looked down at me with a smirk that felt like a whip. "You missed a spot, Mallow," he drawled, his voice dripping with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known hunger. "My father says your soul is as stained as this floor. Clean it. Use your sleeve. I want to see your skin touch the filth you belong to." I did not flinch. I did not rage. I simply pulled back my threadbare cuff, exposing my thin, scarred wrist, and began to wipe the freezing slush with my own shirt. My eyes remained fixed on the wood, dead to the world around me, but my hands remained steady as a surgeon's. Then, a single tear escaped my lash. It hit the floor with a soft tap. It didn't soak in. It sat there, cold and isolated on the wax. The narrator's voice in my head whispered, that tear was the last bit of moisture left in my heart. The desert was coming. The attic was a ribcage of rotting timber and whistling drafts, but it was the only place I could breathe. I huddled under a moth-eaten blanket, clutching a crinkled letter that smelled of lavender and poverty. It was from Bramble, my sister, the only soul who kept my heart beating. "A man can bear his own hunger," I whispered to the shadows, "but he cannot bear the hunger of those he loves." Her words were getting weaker with every letter. She was fading in that distant workhouse, and I was her only hope. "Hold on, Bramble," I breathed, my voice a ghost in the dark. "Just one more season. I will earn the back wages they owe me. I will bring you home." The expectation that I would remain a selfless servant was the only thing keeping the Hallowglass family from casting me into the street, so I played my part. I descended to the master's study, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed the £30 they had withheld for lodging fees. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. Lord Hallowglass was standing by the hearth, the orange glow of the fire making him look like a demon in fine wool. He was tossing papers into the flames. As I approached, a stray gust of wind from the chimney swirled a half-burnt scrap toward my feet. I knelt to retrieve it, thinking it a chore, but the handwriting stopped my heart. It was Bramble's script. He hadn't just withheld my wages, he had been intercepting and burning the cries for help from a dying girl. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. Midnight in the Vancroft Estate felt like being buried alive. I returned to the study after the house had fallen into a drunken slumber, my fingers trembling as I sifted through the grey, flaky remains in the cold fireplace. The fire had been greedy, but it hadn't taken everything. My hands brushed against something hard and cold. I pulled it out, a heavy brass seal, soot-stained but unbroken. It bore the intricate crest of Slowberry Mill, an estate far grander than this crumbling manor. I stared at the seal, the metal biting into my palm. Why would Lord Hallowglass have the seal of the Slowberry heirs? I remembered my father's dying whispers about a stolen son and a rightful seat, words I had dismissed as the delusions of a feverish man. Now, the truth flared up in my mind with terrifying clarity. I wasn't a servant by blood or by some cosmic debt. I was a prisoner in a house built on the ruins of my own family's legacy. The realization was a physical blow. They had kept me here, scrubbing their floors and enduring their insults, not out of charity, but to keep the rightful heir under their thumb where he could never ask questions. I was a lion being told I was a dog, and for 27 years, I had wagged my tail for scraps. My entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. I stood up in the dark, the brass seal hidden in my palm, feeling the weight of expectation shatter. I was no longer a servant, I was an inheritance of dust, and I was beginning to settle. The night of the great autumn gala arrived, a sickening display of gold, silk, and absolute hypocrisy. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering gowns and bloated egos, all dancing atop the labor of men like me. I stood in the center of the room, draped in the stiff and comfortable livery of the house, holding a silver tray laden with crystal flutes of sherry. My legs ached, my spirit was raw, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I watched them laugh, the people who had stolen my sister's life and my father's land. Lord Hallowglass approached me, his face flushed with wine. He didn't see a man, he saw a furniture piece that held drinks. "Mallow!" he barked, loud enough to draw the attention of the bishop and the surrounding gentry. "Take these empty glasses and begone. You're an eyesore in this light, and you smell of the stables. Move, you dull creature." The laughter of the guests rippled through the air, a cruel, tinkling sound that snapped the final thread of my patience. The room went silent, not because I moved, but because I remained perfectly still. I looked Lord Hallowglass directly in the eye, a sin in his world. "I have carried your shadows until my own sun has set," I said. My voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, vibrating hum that cut through the music like a guillotine. "From this moment, I am the debt you can never repay." I tilted the silver tray. The crystal smashed against the floor with a sound like a cannon blast. The rules of my world didn't just bend, they disintegrated. The doors of Vancroft shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the marrow of my bones. I was stripped of my livery, standing in the teeth of a howling winter blizzard wearing nothing but a thin waistcoat and my pride. The wind screamed through the bare trees, bitingly cold, but I felt a strange heat in my chest. Nature was kinder than the aristocracy. The cold only kills the body. The Hallowglasses had spent decades trying to kill my very spirit. I began to walk, my boots sinking deep into the drifts. I had no money, no home, and no destination, but I had the brass seal in my pocket. As I passed the estate's frozen trash heap at the edge of the property, something caught the light of a flickering street lamp. A heavy, leather-bound book lay discarded amidst the ash and frozen rot. It was a ledger, one I recognized from the master's private vault. It had been tossed out in the panic following my defiance at the gala. I knelt in the snow, my fingers blue as I pried the frozen covers apart. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and names, illegal tax evasions, hidden debts, and the systematic stripping of local parishes. It glowed faintly under the moon, a weapon made of paper and ink. Lord Hallowglass thought he had thrown away a nuisance, but he had handed me the keys to his kingdom. I tucked the ledger under my shirt, against my skin, and marched into the white dark. The industrial borough of Oakhaven-on-Marsh was a labyrinth of soot and iron, dominated by a derelict clock tower that groaned like a dying beast. Its gears had long ago seized, leaving the town in a perpetual state of never time. I pushed open the rusted side door, seeking shelter from the ice. Inside, the air smelled of oil and ancient dust. A figure sat among the massive brass cogs, lit by a single, sputtering tallow candle. He was a man who seemed to be made of shadows and sharp angles. He didn't look up from the watch movement he was dissecting. "The wind usually brings dead leaves, not living ghosts," he said, his voice a dry rasp. I stepped forward, the frozen ledger heavy against my ribs. "I am seeking a place where the law of the manor does not reach," I replied. The man finally looked up, his eyes piercing and impossibly old. He studied my face, my tattered clothes, and the way I held myself despite the shivering. "You have the eyes of a man who has died once already, Mr. Mallow," he whispered. "Welcome to the afterlife. I am Ulysses Fenn." He gestured to a corner filled with hay and old newspapers. He didn't ask for my story, he saw it written in the lines of my face. In the heart of the storm, I had found a man who lived outside of time, and a place to plan my resurrection. Beneath the clock tower, in a basement that felt like a tomb, I began my work. I didn't give the starving laborers of Oakhaven bread, I gave them something far more dangerous, the law. I spent my days decoding the Hallowglass ledger and my nights teaching men with calloused hands how to fight with words. We huddled around a low fire, the light flickering off the damp stone walls as I read from the stolen books Ulysses Fenn provided. Paragraph of shivering weavers whose looms had been seized for unfair debts. They cannot seize your tools of trade if the debt is unverified by a magistrate. When the bailiffs come tomorrow, you do not use your fists. You use this sentence. I watched their eyes ignite. Hope was a terrifying thing to see in the eyes of the desperate. It was a quiet rebellion, a slow-building tide of literacy and litigation. I became the debt doctor, a ghost who moved through the slums, curing the plague of expectation that the poor must always suffer in silence. I never took a penny for my services. My payment was the growing realization that Lord Hallowglass's power was a fragile glass dome, held up only by the ignorance of those he stepped upon. I was the hammer, and I was teaching the city how to swing. The Hallowglasses were not fools, they noticed the change in the wind. One evening, as I left a hidden meeting in the rookeries, 3 men with heavy cudgels and eyes like cold flint emerged from the fog. They didn't want the ledger, they wanted my silence. I turned and ran, not toward the clock tower, but toward the echoing brick tunnels of the London sewers. The splashing of their heavy boots behind me sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The air in the tunnels was thick and foul, the darkness absolute except for the occasional shaft of moonlight through a grate. They hunted me like a rat, their taunts echoing off the curved walls. "Come out, Mallow. We have a message from the master." I reached a junction where a massive steam vent from the upper factories hissed with pent-up pressure. I knew this layout, I had studied the city's blueprints in Fenn's tower. As they rounded the corner, I grabbed the iron lever of the vent and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left. A wall of scalding, white fog erupted into the tunnel, a blinding curtain of heat and noise. The thugs recoiled, screaming as the vapor burned their lungs. I didn't stay to watch. I vanished into a narrow brickwork crawl space, moving through the dark like a shadow. They forgot that a rat knows the dark better than the hound. I emerged miles away, shivering and wet, but still breathing. A week later, a black carriage with velvet curtains pulled up beside me as I walked through the fog. A gloved hand beckoned me inside. To my surprise, it was Lady Eglantine, a rival to the Hallowglass name, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper business sense. The interior of the carriage smelled of expensive sandalwood and power. She looked at me with a predatory sort of admiration, her fan clicking shut like a trap. "I can give you the Hallowglass head on a platter, Thistlewood," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "I know about the ledger. I know about the mill. Sign this agreement, and I will use my influence to crush Pritchard Hallowglass by morning. You will be a rich man, and I will be the owner of his lands." She slid a parchment toward me, a fountain pen already inked. It was the easy way out, the path to instant wealth and revenge. I looked at the contract, then at her cold, ambitious eyes. "I will not trade one master for another, my lady," I said, handing the paper back. "I seek justice, not a new leash. If I win this way, I am no better than the man who broke me." Her face hardened into a mask of disdain. "You are a fool, Mallow. You will die with your principles in the gutter." I stepped out of the carriage. "Perhaps," I replied, "but I will die a man, not a pawn." The rumors of my sister's fate had finally led me to the black iron gates of the St. Jude's workhouse. It was a grim, soot-stained fortress where the poor were sent to be forgotten. The sound of rhythmic hammering, metal on stone, vibrated through the air, a heartbeat of misery. I stood at the gate, my breath hitching as I peered through a cracked window in the laundry ward. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. There she was. Bramble. My sister, who once had a laugh like a spring meadow, was now a hollow-cheeked ghost. She was hunched over a pile of jagged rocks, breaking them with a heavy mallet. Her hands were wrapped in bloody rags, and her eyes were fixed on the floor with the same dead stare I had worn at Vancroft. The Hallowglasses hadn't just stolen my money, they had sold my sister's flesh to the state to keep her from finding me. The anger I felt wasn't a flare, it was a cold, enduring frost. I didn't storm the gates, I didn't have the power yet. Instead, I watched her, memorizing the rhythm of her labor. I realized then that my mission wasn't just about a mill or a title. It was about her. Every stone she broke was a debt I would collect from Lord Hallowglass, with interest. I turned away, the iron gates reflecting in my eyes, and began to plan my most dangerous infiltration yet. To save Bramble, I had to become a ghost once more. I smeared my face with lime dust and donned the tattered rags of a vagrant, slipping into the intake line of the workhouse under a false name. The guards didn't look at faces, they looked at numbers. I was assigned to the quarry, working just yards away from where the women labored in the breaking yards. The dust filled my lungs, and the sun beat down on my neck, but I didn't feel it. During the meager lunch break, a bowl of watery gruel and a crust of hard bread, I managed to shuffle closer to her. She was sitting on a pile of rubble, her head bowed. I leaned in as if to sharpen my tool, my heart hammering. I slipped a small piece of dried apple, a luxury I had saved for 3 days, into her cracked hand. Her fingers brushed mine, and for a second, she stiffened. She didn't look up, for looking up invited the lash, but I saw her shoulders tremble. She didn't recognize me yet, I was just a shadow in the dust, but she felt the warmth of a human gesture in a place designed to extinguish humanity. I whispered a single word into the wind, soon. She clutched the apple as if it were a diamond. I went back to my stones, my muscles screaming, but my soul singing. I was inside. Now, I just had to get us out. The escape was timed with the arrival of a pea soup fog, a thick, yellow Victorian mist that turned the world into a blind man's nightmare. I had sabotaged the lock on the women's ward hours earlier using a sliver of metal from the quarry. As the clock struck midnight, I slipped through the shadows, found Bramble, and pulled her from her cot. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying hope. "Thistle," she breathed. "Is it really you?" "Silence, little bird," I whispered, wrapping my coat around her thin frame. "We walk now, or we die here." We moved through the workhouse like smoke. I knew the guard rotations from my days of observation. We reached the outer wall, where I had loosened a stone near the drainage pipe. The city swallowed us whole the moment we stepped into the street. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hand, but I knew the path to the clock tower by heart. We stumbled through the dark, the sounds of distant whistles and barking dogs chasing us. Bramble was weak, her breath coming in ragged gasps, so I lifted her onto my back. I carried her through the labyrinth of Oakhaven, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. For the first time in my life, being invisible was my greatest weapon. We reached the tower just as the sun began to bleed through the grey, 2 ghosts returning from the grave. Ulysses Fenn was waiting for us, his candle burning low. He looked at Bramble with a surprising tenderness, then turned to me. "The hounds are out, Thistlewood. Hallowglass has realized his prisoner is gone." He walked to the massive central gear of the clock and pulled a hidden lever. The gear slid back with a groan of metal, revealing a secret room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of legal files, wax-sealed envelopes, and old maps. "I wasn't always a hermit," Fenn said, his voice regaining its former strength. 30 years ago, I was the head solicitor for the Slowbury estate. I was the man who drew up your father's will. When the Hallowglasses staged their accident and seized the lands, they tried to hang me for forgery to keep me quiet. I escaped into the gears of this tower and waited for a sign. He pulled out a dusty blue folder. "I waited for you." He laid out the documents on a workbench. My father's signature was there, bold and clear. "The Hallowglasses think they killed the past," Fenn whispered. "But the past has been hiding in the clock, counting every second until the reckoning." I looked at the files, years of evidence, hidden lineages, and the true cost of my family's blood. The weight of expectation was gone, replaced by the weight of a crown I never knew I possessed. The next morning, a knock came at the base of the tower. I descended to find a man in a tall hat, Lord Hallowglass's personal agent. He didn't come with guards, he came with a bag. We met in the overgrown graveyard of the church next door, the headstones leaning like drunken sailors. He placed a heavy sack of gold coins atop a flat tombstone. The clink of the metal was sickeningly loud in the morning quiet. "The master is prepared to be generous," the agent said, his eyes darting nervously toward the tower. "Take this gold. Take your sister. Leave England on the evening tide. You can live like a king in the Americas, Mallow. Why die in a gutter for a title that no longer exists?" It was enough money to buy a new life, 1,000 times over. It was the ultimate temptation, comfort over truth. I looked at the gold, then at the agent. I reached down, but I didn't touch the bag. Instead, I picked up a handful of damp, black dirt from the base of the tombstone. I let the soil trickle through my fingers. "This is the only land you and your master truly own, sir," I said, my voice cold. "Tell Lord Hallowglass that his gold is as hollow as his heart. I am coming for the mill, and I am coming for the truth." That evening, a shadow appeared at the tower door. It was Balthazar Hallowglass. Gone was the arrogant youth, he looked dishevelled, his eyes rimmed with red. "Thistlewood," he croaked, holding up his hands. "My father is mad. He's going to kill us all to keep his secrets. I have the secondary ledger, the one that proves the fraud. Take it. Please. Just let me have enough money to get away." He looked truly repentant, a son broken by his father's sins. Ulysses Fenn watched from the shadows, his hand on a heavy iron bar. I stepped forward, looking into Balthazar's eyes. A snake shedding its skin is still a snake, I thought. I reached out and took the book he offered. It looked identical to the one I had found in the trash. "Thank you, Balthazar," I said softly. "You've done the right thing." As he turned to leave, a smug glint appeared in his eye for a fraction of a second. He lunged for the main ledger sitting on the table, thinking I had lowered my guard. But my hand was already there. I slammed the book shut, pinning his fingers. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the weight was wrong?" I opened the book he gave me. It was filled with blank pages. I had given him a decoy ledger I had prepared hours ago. "You haven't changed," I said, pushing him toward the door. "Go back to your father and tell him his son is as poor a thief as he is a man." The real breakthrough came when I was sitting with Bramble. She was knitting a simple wool scarf, her fingers moving in a rhythmic, subconscious pattern she had learned from our mother. I looked at the mother's code in the margins of the real ledger, mysterious sequences of P and K that had baffled even Ulysses Fenn. "Pearl and knit," I whispered, my heart skipping a beat. "Bramble, show me that pattern again." I realized that the sequences weren't just instructions for wool, they were a book cipher. Each pattern corresponded to specific page numbers and paragraph headers in the family Bible we had carried from our childhood home. My father hadn't just left a ledger, he had left a map disguised as a hobby. My mother's knitting was the key to my father's safe. It was a language of love used to protect a legacy of truth. As I decoded the patterns, a name kept appearing, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. My father hadn't been fighting a local lord, he had been a secret auditor for the crown. The Hallowglasses hadn't just stolen from a family, they had defrauded the British Empire. The final decoded sentence made my blood run cold, *, the foundations of Vancroft are built on the king's debt. *, I had them. Not just in a civil court, but in a trial for treason. I presented the decoded findings to Ulysses Fenn. He stared at the documents, his face pale in the candlelight. "God in heaven," he breathed. The Hallowglasses were never lords. They were merely squatters in the king's shadow. The documents revealed that the entire Vancroft estate had been forfeited to the crown 50 years ago due to a previous ancestor's crimes. My family had been the appointed trustees, the guardians of the land. The Hallowglasses had simply moved in after a fire destroyed the local records office, banking on the fact that no one would challenge a lord. They had spent half a century playing a part, wearing clothes they didn't own and spending money that belonged to the treasury. I was the last living trustee. I was the only person with the legal authority to evict them or to report the theft of 50 years of taxes. The stakes were no longer personal. I held a document with a grand royal seal, a sleeping giant of a law that would crush the Hallowglass name into the dirt the moment it was revealed in court. I sat back, the weight of the revelation settling over me. I had the power to destroy them utterly. I could make them as homeless as I had been on that winter night. But as I looked at Bramble's peaceful face, I knew I had to be careful. I stood on a hill overlooking the Vancroft Manor, the stone walls looking grey and sickly in the twilight. I had a choice. Revenge is a fire that consumes the archer, but mercy is the arrow that never misses. I spent the night drafting a legal filing that was a masterpiece of strategic restraint. I didn't ask for their deaths or their imprisonment. I asked for the restoration of the trustee rights and the freedom of every servant on the estate. I prepared a mercy trap. I would offer them a way out. They could sign over the estate quietly and keep a small portion of their personal wealth to live in exile. If they refused, I would unleash the treason charges. It was a chance for them to save their lives, even if they lost their status. I wanted to leave them with the bones of the house, the empty structure of their pride, without the meat of their power. Ulysses Fenn looked at the papers. "You're being too kind, Thistlewood. They won't take it. Men like Hallowglass would rather burn the world than admit they were never kings." I looked at the manor one last time. "Then let them strike the match," I said. "I have given them the choice I was never given. My conscience is clear. The rest is up to the law." The response to my offer was not a signature, but a squad of Metropolitan Police. I was arrested at the base of the clock tower for theft of identity and sedition. Lord Hallowglass had used his last remaining connections to bribe a magistrate and turn the law against its own protector. As they clamped the iron shackles around my wrists, I didn't fight. I looked at Bramble and nodded. She knew what to do. "The truth often goes to jail before it goes to court," I whispered to her as they dragged me toward the black carriage. I was thrown into a damp, stone cell in the Newgate Prison, the air thick with the smell of despair and unwashed bodies. They took the ledger, but they couldn't take what I had memorized. I sat in the dark, the cold iron biting into my skin, feeling a strange sense of peace. I was back in the dirt, back at the bottom of the world. But this time, I wasn't there because of expectation. I was there because of conviction. I listened to the scratching of rats in the walls and began to plan my defense. I wasn't a servant scrubbing a floor anymore, I was a man waiting for his day in the light. The shackles were heavy, but my spirit was weightless. The prison was meant to break me, but I spent my time turning it into a school. Using a sharp stone, I scratched letters into the damp floor of my cell, teaching the illiterate guards and my fellow prisoners how to read. It was the literacy of liberty. One guard, a man with a scarred face named Miller, watched me for days before finally asking, "Why help us, Mallow? We're the ones who lock the door." I looked up from the stone I was carving. "Because a man who can read cannot be ruled by fear, Mr. Miller," I replied. "And a man who is not afraid is a man who can see the truth." I taught them the sections of the legal code that protected their own rights, rights their masters had never told them they possessed. Within a week, the atmosphere in the block had shifted. The guards no longer mocked me, they brought me extra candles and scraps of paper. They began to see me not as a criminal, but as a man of profound integrity. Information began to flow into my cell, news from the outside, the movements of the Hallowglass lawyers, and the fact that public opinion in Oakhaven was turning. The dead doctor was in jail, and the city was starting to growl. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was a court of lions, filled with high-ranking aristocrats in powdered wigs and silk robes. The air was thick with the smell of old ink and prejudice. I was led in, still in my chains, to face a judge who was a cousin to the Hallowglass family. The deck was not just stacked, it was marked. The gallery was packed with the people I had helped, their faces grim and expectant. Lord Hallowglass sat in the front row, looking smugly at his fingernails. His lawyer began a character assassination, calling me a delusional servant and a thief of family secrets. He painted a picture of a man who had bitten the hand that fed him. I stood there, silent and steady, watching the clock on the wall. I was waiting for the moment when the arrogance of the lion would lead him into the pit. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't address the judge. I addressed the jury, the common men of London. I am accused of stealing a name, I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the hall. But how can one steal what was already his by birth? I am not here to defend my character. I am here to expose a ghost. The judge hammered his gavel, but the room was already leaning in. A hush fell over the court as my first witness was called. It was the humble stableman from Vancroft, the man I had taken the blame for. He stood in the witness box, his cap clutched in his trembling hands, looking terrified at the finery surrounding him. Lord Hallowglass leaned forward, a sneer on his face, certain the man would crumble. "Tell the court," I said gently, "about the mud on the floor of the Vancroft manor." The stableman looked at me, then at the lord. He took a deep breath. "Mr. Mallow took the lash for me," he whispered, his voice gaining strength. "He took the blame for a lord's lie. A man who does that, a man who protects the weak even when it costs him his blood, that man doesn't steal ledgers. He saves souls. He's the only true gentleman in that house." The testimony was a physical blow to the Hallowglass defense. It didn't prove the fraud, but it broke the image of me as a common thief. The jury looked at me with new eyes. I saw the bishop shift uncomfortably in his seat. The silent pillar was no longer silent, and his echoes were starting to shake the foundations of the room. The trial reached its fever pitch. I stood, despite the weight of my chains, and looked directly at Lord Hallowglass. "You claim I stole the Hallowglass ledger because I am a common criminal," I said. "And you claim that you are the rightful owner of the Slowbury Mill. If that is true, Lord Pritchard, tell the court, what is the motto inscribed on the inner spine of the family Bible? A true gentleman would know his own heritage." Hallowglass turned pale. He glanced at his lawyer, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He had spent 50 years in that house, but he had never truly cared for its history, only its profit. He didn't know the motto. He didn't know the heart of the home he had stolen. He stammers, "It is strength and honor, of course." I pulled a small, scorched scrap of paper from my pocket, the one I had saved from the fire. "Incorrect," I said. "The motto is in silence, truth. The very thing you tried to burn, and the very thing that has brought you here today." The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel in vain. The trap had snapped shut. Hallowglass had proven, on the record, that he was a stranger in his own house. Suddenly, the smell of wood smoke drifted through the open windows of the courtroom. One of the bailiffs rushed in, his face white with terror. "The Vancroft manor," he shouted. "It's ablaze. The whole estate is going up." Lord Hallowglass let out a strangled cry. He had realized that the trial was lost, and in a final act of spite, he had sent his men to burn the evidence, and the house, to the ground. "When the lie fails, the liar burns the stage," I shouted over the chaos. The judge abandoned the bench as the room dissolved into panic. I didn't look at the judge or the lawyers. I looked at Hallowglass, who was trying to slip out a side door. But my mind was elsewhere. I remembered the children of the servants. I remembered the youngest Hallowglass son, a boy who was innocent of his father's sins. I didn't wait for the guards to unlock my chains. I used the heavy iron link to shatter the window of the prisoner's dock and leaped into the street. The orange light of the fire was reflecting in the windows of the city, a pillar of smoke rising in the distance. I ran toward the flames, not to save the money or the documents, but to save the life that was still inside. I reached the manor just as the roof of the east wing collapsed. The heat was a physical wall, the air thick with the roar of hungry flames. The servants were huddled on the lawn, weeping, but Lady Hester was screaming, pointing toward the upper nursery. "My son! Barnaby is still inside." The staircase was a charred skeleton, and the smoke was a black curtain. I didn't think. I wetted my shirt in the fountain and sprinted into the collapsing foyer. I went back into the hell I had just escaped, the weight of the burning timber now the only expectation I had to carry. I found the boy huddled under a grand piano in the music room, the only thing protecting him from the falling plaster. He was too terrified to move, his eyes wide with the reflection of the fire. I scooped him up, shielding him with my own body as the floor groaned beneath us. "Hold your breath, little one," I whispered. I could feel the hair on my arm singeing, the heat blistering my skin. I didn't feel like a servant or a lord. I felt like a human being, doing the only thing that mattered. I turned and ran back through the tunnel of fire, the world crashing down behind me. I emerged from the front door of Vancroft just as the entire entrance portico crumbled into ash. I was black with soot, my clothes smouldering, my lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass. I carried the boy across the lawn and placed him in his mother's arms. The crowd, the police, the neighbors, the servants, went deathly silent. They didn't see a criminal or a disgraced clerk. They saw a miracle. I collapsed onto the grass, the cool moisture of the evening dew feeling like heaven against my skin. I watched the great house burn, the stolen gold and the fake portraits melting into a single, meaningless puddle of slag. The Hallowglass legacy was ending in a funeral pyre of its own making. I had saved the only thing worth saving from that house. A reporter from the London Times was there, his pen scratching furiously. The story of the Saint of Cinders would be on every doorstep by morning. I looked at my hands, they were burned and scarred, but they were finally clean. The fire had washed away the mud of 27 years. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cold, night air, knowing the war was over. Lady Hester Hallowglass fell to her knees in the mud beside me, her silk gown ruined, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked at her son, then at me, and then at her husband, who was being restrained by the police at the edge of the lawn. The arrogance in her eyes had been burned away, replaced by a devastating clarity. "Enough," she whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet. "Enough," she shouted, turning toward the officers. "He saved my son while my husband saved his gold. The ledger is true. Every word of it. We were never the heirs. We were thieves, and we have lived on the blood of better men for too long." Her confession was the final nail in the coffin. She handed over a small, fireproof locket she had been wearing. It contained the original royal decree the family had hidden for decades. The police moved in to arrest Lord Pritchard Hallowglass. He didn't go with dignity, he screamed and cursed, blaming everyone but himself. I watched them lead him away, a small, broken man in an expensive coat. He had lost his house, his family, and his name. Justice hadn't come from a gavel, it had come from the heart of a woman who finally chose her child over a lie. 2 days later, the London docks were a grey expanse of fog and salt. Lord Hallowglass had been released on a technicality of bail, pending his trial for treason. He was trying to flee to the Americas, a single trunk in his hand, a shadow among the sailors. There was no horizon far enough to outrun a guilty conscience, but he was going to try. I was waiting for him at the end of the pier. I stood there, my arm in a sling, watching the black water churn against the wood. He stopped when he saw me, his face twisting in a mask of pure hatred. "You think you've won, Mallow?" he hissed. "I still have more gold in my pocket than you'll ever see in your life. I'll start again, and you'll still be a servant at heart." He tried to push past me, but I didn't move. No guards came. No crowds gathered. It was just the two of us, the man who lived under expectation and the man who created it. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no hate, only a profound sense of pity. He was a man who had everything and possessed nothing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, dirty copper penny, the one I had found in the dirt on my first day of exile. I held the penny out to him. He stared at it, confused. "This is the price of your soul, Pritchard," I said. My voice was steady, the sound of a man who had finally found his own rhythm. "Take it. You'll need it to pay the ferryman. I have forgotten you. Starting today, the world will too. Your name will be a footnote in a history of fraud, a cautionary tale for children." He reached out, his hands shaking so violently that when he touched the coin, it slipped through his fingers and fell into the black, oily water of the Thames. He stared at the spot where it vanished, his mouth working silently. He had no more words. He was a ghost before he even boarded the ship. I turned and walked away, not looking back as the horn of the steamship echoed through the fog. The guillotine of silence had fallen. I had denied him the one thing he wanted, to be my enemy. By forgiving him and forgetting him, I had robbed him of his power over my story. I walked toward the city, the sun breaking through the clouds, feeling the air fill my lungs. I was no longer a shadow. I was the light. The Slowberry Mill was a different place a year later. The sun hit the water wheel, turning the spray into 1,000 dancing diamonds. The sound wasn't the groan of a dying beast, but the steady, humming heartbeat of a community. Children played in the meadow, and the workers were no longer servants, they were partners. Bramble stood at the window of the main house, her cheeks rosy, her laugh finally returning to the halls. I sat in a simple wooden chair on the porch, watching the world I had helped build. I had refused the grand titles, choosing instead to be the trustee my father wanted me to be. I lived for years beneath the weight of expectation, but now I stood beneath the light of my own making. People often asked me why I didn't take my revenge when I had the chance. I always gave them the same answer. I looked at the camera, at the world, with a small, tired, but triumphant smile. The rules of the world are written in ink by men who think they are gods. But a man's character, that is written in blood and forged in the fire. I picked up a quill and began to write the new rules for the mill. I was finally Thistlewood Mallow, and my story was just beginning.